Hey everyone, this is Dr. M. This is another supplemental video to my genetics lecture course. This one's going to cover the concepts of dominant and recessive alleles and what is the molecular nature of different alleles that makes them dominant or recessive. So let's start with basic principles. An allele is defined as dominant or recessive. We can tell if it's dominant or recessive based on what it looks like in the heterozygote. So we can't actually tell what an allele is doing if it's in a pure breeding form as a homozygous state. Dominance or recessiveness is defined by the heterozygote. And this is because we define dominance and recessiveness by whether one allele, the dominant allele, masks the phenotype that would normally be produced by the recessive allele. All right? And we can only tell that when they're both together in the heterozygote. It's important to note that recessiveness is caused by a lack of function in a gene or an allele, lack of function in an allele. And as an example of this, we often think of white flower petals as the flower is producing a white pigment. This is not the case. Biologically, the flower petals are white because they lack a pigment, maybe a red or whatever pigment that flower might normally produce is totally absent, and so it looks white to us. So again, white in this case is not the presence of anything. It is defined by the lack of it. And so white coloration is a recessive trait because in a heterozygote, if you only have one functional allele that can churn out pigment, enough pigment, then you end up with a phenotype that looks just like the dominant homozygote. Okay, so even if one allele isn't functioning in the heterozygote, if the other allele can make up for it and be a team player, you can achieve the same phenotype as a dominant homozygote individual. It is important to note that not all dominant alleles are what we call wild type or normal alleles. So by wild type, we typically mean the allele most prevalent in a population. When we're talking about disease phenotypes, we're going to distinguish between a disease phenotype and a normal phenotype. So for example, many disease alleles are recessive, but some are not. And so it's important to not automatically associate a dominant allele with the normal allele or the wild type allele. So for example, Huntington's disease is caused by a dominant mutation. And the interesting thing about these types of mutations, there are a myriad types of mutations, ways that we can classify mutations, which we will go into at another time. But one very broad category that we can put mutations into is loss of function or gain of function. Loss of function mutations means something's turned off, something no longer works. As a gene can no longer produce enough protein or the proper protein to be functional. This is a loss of function, and this is typically going to be a recessive allele. A gain of function is when something accidentally gets turned on and can't be shut off. And that can be true of different types of cancers. And so these types of mutations, and if they're heritable, they become alleles in a population. These types of alleles are dominant. Okay, I want to talk about a related topic, and that is the idea that there can be many ways for a gene to break. So this is a schematic of the gene that causes PKU, or phenylketonuria. And there are dozens of identified mutations that can be responsible for the phenotype of PKU. And these are all loss of function mutations. And it is possible for an individual to inherit one loss of function mutation from one parent, say at this locus, or at this locus 10, and they could inherit a different loss of function mutation from dad. Okay, so this individual is still genetically heterozygous, but because this individual would have both a 10 and a 4 mutation, they're not identical. These are different forms of the gene. They're still different alleles, which makes this individual heterozygote, but they are still going to have the recessive phenotype of PKU because neither of these genes work. Neither of these alleles work, okay? And so in a heterozygous individual who has one normal allele and one mutant allele for PKU, for this gene, the function allele is going to be able to be a team player and pick up the pace and produce enough protein that that individual has a normal phenotype. However, if an individual inherits 2 broken alleles, then nobody's a team player, and then PKU results. These types of individuals are called compound heterozygotes because they are genetically heterozygous, but they are phenotypically recessive.